Okay, so far in our study, we've looked at the fact that King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had a dream. This dream troubled him, and he sought an explanation for the dream, but so that he could know the explanation was trustworthy, he had to have whoever told him the interpretation also tell him the dream. And none of the sorcerers and astrologers and all that who were on payroll could do that. Even they acknowledged that in order to do that, it had to be a supernatural thing to be able to tell somebody their dream, of course, and the interpretation. And it was Daniel and his friends who petitioned the God of heaven to show them the dream, and he did. And Daniel went into the king's court and told him that the dream was a timeline that would extend to the end of time, when the God of heaven would establish his kingdom on earth. And he told him that the dream was for those the benefit would be for those who were living in the latter days. So clearly it was a timeline that started with the kingdom of Babylon, would extend into the next kingdom, the third kingdom, a fourth kingdom. That fourth kingdom would be divided, and that fourth kingdom in its divided state would be when the kingdom of heaven establishes it all, breaks the whole system down, and establishes the kingdom of the Most High God. So that's what we saw in Daniel 2. It was verified that Nebuchadnezzar accepted the interpretation because he knew that only the God of heaven could have enabled someone to show him what his dream was. And now we're going to look at Daniel chapter 5. Now, of course, we've skipped 3 and 4. Those don't really deal with prophecy. They deal more with character development and obedience to the Most High God. Daniel 5 is what's going to show us the next kingdom in this sequence. Okay, so again, you had Babylon, and of course the next kingdom, as we saw, as we know from history, is Media Persia, and we're going to see that portrayed here in Bible prophecy. So Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar. Now this is a descendant, or maybe a later family member of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, now it's Belshazzar, not to be confused with Belteshazzar, which was Daniel's Babylonian name. So Belshazzar was one of the kings, or one of the rulers, if you will, of Babylon. Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the thousands. Belshazzar, whiles he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes and his wives, his concubines, drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold, and of silver, and of brass, of iron, of wood, and stone. So, they're having some drunken revelry at the expense of the sacred vessels that were taken from the temple in Jerusalem when Babylon invaded Jerusalem. Verse 5. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall in the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. So in the midst of this revelry, all of a sudden, Belshazzar looks and sees the fingers of a man's hand writing on a wall, and it completely changed his countenance. So he went from happy to something else. And it says, so that the joints of his loins were loosed. My man soiled himself based on what he saw. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what I would think if I saw fingers just all of a sudden writing on a wall, but it was enough to loosen the joints of his loins. Verse 7, the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers and the Calibans and the Soothsayers. So here they go again, the worthless people on payroll. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing nor make known to the king the interpretation. So, same as Nebuchadnezzar and his worthless wise men. Verse 9, then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. Verse 10, now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. There is a man in thy kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him. Whom the king Nebuchadnezzar thy father, the king, I say thy father, made master of the magicians, the astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Verse 12, forasmuch as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. I love that, dissolving of doubts. And that's what prophecy does, is it dissolves doubts when you see the prophecies unfold. Verse 13, then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? Now, of course, Daniel's a much older man now, but Belshazzar is referring to when he was first brought into Babylon as likely a teenager. Verse 15. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. Verse 16, and I have heard of thee that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writings and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. So Daniel's like, look, I got no interest in what you want to give, but I'll let you know what's up. Verse 18, O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would he slew, and whom he would he kept alive, and whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. That's what was in Daniel chapter 4. Again, dealing with character development. Back to verse 21 here in Daniel 5. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appoints over it whomsoever he will. And thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all of this, but has lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver, and of gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hands thy breath is, and whose are in all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. Wow. So it's like, you should have known better. You've known the story of Nebuchadnezzar. You saw what happened with him, with his pride. And here you are praising all these false gods when the very God who gives you breath, you have not glorified. Verse 25. And this is the writing that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Peres, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet and put a chain about his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. And Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old, or 62 years old. So, and just going back to verse 25, you see it's interesting. It says it's many, many tekel upharsin, but in the explanation he says many tekel peres. I need to look into why there's that difference there. But essentially what we're seeing is verification that after the kingdom of Babylon came the kingdom of the Medes and Persians. And that's what we see here in the end of Daniel chapter 5. So in summary of Daniel chapter 5, we see that the Babylonian king, Belshazzar in this case, was in defiance of the Most High God. Interestingly enough, he and his wives and concubines and princes and so forth were drunk with the wine of Babylon. And when you study Revelation, you see that that's an actual thing, and it leads to just outright disobedience. But in Daniel 5, it records the fall of Babylon to the Media Persians. And you know in history that the Persians, it was a joint kingdom. The Persian army diverted the flow of the Euphrates River so that they were able to march under the walls of Babylon while the citizens were all preoccupied in drunken revelry. Now, something that's important to note is that the kingdom of Caldea was given to Darius the Mede, who was governor over that kingdom. When the Medes and Persians took over the kingdom of Babylon, the kingdom was greater than just the kingdom of Babylon. Okay, it included whatever other territory that the Medes and Persians had conquered. So Darius the Mede was never ruler of the entire Media-Persian Empire. He was given the kingdom of Caldea in what we would call today as, like, say, a governor. As a governor of a state within the country where you have a federal president. Same situation here, because Cyrus the Great was ruler over the entire empire. Darius the Mede was only ruler of the territory or the kingdom of Caldea, of Babylon itself. Again, because if you look through, if you go online and try to search, well, who was Darius the Mede? There was no Darius the Persian that took over in this scenario. It was a different person. There was a Darius the Persian that will come along later. But again, the kingdom was given to Darius the Mede. The kingdom of Babylonia was given to Darius the Mede. So please, when you look online and you're studying this out, you're going to see that there's no Darius the Mede that took over. And many will stop there and say, okay, well, that means the Bible is not true. you have to dig a little deeper. But what we see in Daniel chapter 5 is a biblical connection between the fall of Babylon and the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire as it relates to the rule of the people of God. And again, that's something that was foretold before it happened, and we can go back to history and see its fulfillment. And so just another event that's documented in history that is building on the foundation and should be reinforcing our trust to say, this was foretold, this happened, let's see what happens next.